Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another episode of Texting. I'm Mark Will in Taipei.
And I'm Tomek in St. Petersburg.
Well, today our topic is graffiti, and this topic was requested by a friend of the pod, Maria S. So we're happy to take requests. Keep that in mind. If you have a text or topic that you would like us to cover on texting, hit us up on Substack or some other way.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, thanks for the recommendation. Even if it isn't something that I would have naturally chosen to look at in detail, it's actually been a cool topic to consider for the past 10 days or so.
Yes, indeed. So I'm thinking when we consider this topic, graffiti, we should start with the word. You know, what is graffiti? What does the word mean? Of course, I want to consider the etymology. So it's an Italian word, right? But it goes back to
Graffiare,
Greek,
right?
That sounds right, but I'm taking it back even further. Like so many other things, it goes back to the Greeks, and the Greek verb graphein is the etymon, I guess you could say, of this word that we're considering, this topic. So what does that mean, graphein? Well, the obvious English derivative would be graph, right?
Right.
Y'all know what a graph is.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in Greek, it had a lot of different meanings, this verb, one of which is to scratch or to cut, to sketch, to draw, to paint, and of course, to write. So graffiti is something that is written, but graffiti is actually the plural form. Do you know the singular?
I do.
Trivia question.
Yeah. Graffito, correct?
Yeah. A graffito. So technically, you shouldn't say a graffiti because that's plural.
Yeah, I've heard that graffiti purists, graffiti writers, they only speak to each other in ancient Greek.
That sounds about right. Yeah. They're very concerned about grammatical issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, why is that relevant? The notion that graffiti is a kind of graphing or writing. Well, in my research for this episode, I watched a PBS documentary from 1983 called Style Wars.
It was PBS that produced it?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was a PBS documentary, 1983, Style Wars, and style is an interesting word too. Do you know the origin of that? Our word style, where does that come from?
Tell me, a wise one.
Okay, yes. I was hoping you'd say that. Stylus. So your style is determined by the instrument that you use to write with, at least etymologically, right?
Okay.
So when we're talking about graffiti, we're talking about a kind of writing. And
so remind me, what does stylus mean?
Well, a stylus,
it's an instrument, yeah?
Well, yeah, it was used to write on a wax tablet, for example. I mean, it's a kind of pen. We still use it today. People talk about the stylus they use to tap on their smartphone or whatever.
Okay, yeah.
But in ancient times, the stylus was was basically a pen, right? You would write on a wax tablet or um, maybe some other uh, surface, parchment or
Clay, maybe.
vellum. Yeah, I mean, like with clay tablets, I'm thinking of like Sumerian cuneiform. Um, I don't know that they called the thing they marked on clay tablets with a stylus. I mean, of course, the Sumerians didn't, but maybe when the Greeks were talking about the Sumerians, they used stylus to refer to whatever instrument they used when they were marking on the clay tablets. But okay, one of the first lines in Style Wars, this was very interesting.
Do you want to give a little bit more context about the film?
Well, I don't know a lot about it other than, what I watched on YouTube, but as I said, it's a PBS documentary.
I mean, I watched it too, so I could just give a very brief description.
Yeah, please. Sure.
So it's based in New York City, very much rooted in hip hop culture. And many people who learn about hip hop and the history of hip hop, one of the first things, first, New York is usually considered the birthplace of hip hop. Maybe that's overly obvious, but, And second, people often learn about the four elements that make up hip hop, and that's breakdancing, rapping, scratching or DJing, and graffiti writing, or so
otherwise known as bombing.
Yeah,
and another term which I think I heard it used in the documentary, but it doesn't feature prominently. Another synonym of bombing is tagging, and I think that's more in use today than maybe it was in the 80s.
I'm going to slightly correct you here.
Okay. Do so, oh wise one.
Well, no, just I've also been learning terms and writing those down in my notes. So if we want to jump into all that, bombing means to cover in graffiti, and it's like to bomb something is to really like go hard, and whereas tagging is the level 1 form of graffiti where just you put your name, not necessarily denoting the size. Let me just give you a few more terms that are interesting. So they basically describe these different gradients. And again, to somebody who's like an actual graffiti artist, we're going to sound like some,
jackasses. Which we are.
But that's fine. But most people, I don't think, know this stuff. So level 1 is to tag. After that is something called a throw up, which is when you write your name, but maybe without incredible level of detail, but more than a tag. After a throw up is a burner, which is when you've really put a lot of emphasis and energy into the way that you've designed your name with an outline, with color. So it's like more approaching something like art. After that is a piece. And finally is a mural. And what's interesting is that I was watching one documentary today. I'll find the name later, but I think it's something called like Infamy. And graffiti artists were basically saying that not all writers follow this rule, but when you're preparing to create your art somewhere, you're meant to not go over. It's like you're meant to like respect this hierarchy. So you can paint over a tag if you're doing a throw up, but like you shouldn't tag over a throw up.
No,
right? So it's like
I see.
Yeah, so it's kind of like that's interesting. And also another just quick thing about these terms that's interesting is that many graffiti artists that I listened to interviews about were insistent on the fact that you absolutely need this gradation to grow as an artist. Like nobody could start without the tag. Like even though the tag may seem kind of like vulgar and primitive to people on the outside, because it just seems like they've just scribbled their name, but it's like a key stepping stone for learning the art and learning the craft. So nobody is derogative towards towards tagging in the industry, right? Like I personally, and we'll get into this later, I'm not really a big fan of tagging, but I didn't hear anyone inside that world who was particularly snobby about it.
Okay.
You know? So well, anyway, okay.
See, I think I am a fan of the tagging.
Okay.
Because it's like the most elemental form of self-expression. It's saying, I am here, I exist. And these kids that are featured in the documentary, you know, one of the things, you remember the young man in the kitchen with his mom, and his mom is ridiculing him to some extent and saying, why are you wasting your time? And you know, he says, because I'm able to write my name. My name is out there, you know. That in itself was self-affirming, I guess you could say, for this young man, or for anyone who does that, you know. It's saying, I am here, I exist, I am somebody. I'm not nothing. I'm not anonymous. You're going to remember me.
Okay, so we're obviously just jumping right in, to this stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean,
should we do any more like global contextualizing?
Well, we can go back to it, but I mean, I'm thinking of like the documentary mentions this Taki 183,
right,
who was like, his name started appearing all over the city, mostly in the Bronx, maybe, but then he would go to other parts of NYC, and people started talking about him, you know, because his name was everywhere. Who is Taki 183? And it reminded me of this terrible movie from the 80s called Turk 182. I thought maybe it was inspired by this guy. But also it reminds me of this Houston-based rapper named Mike Jones. Have you heard about him?
Yeah.
Mike Jones. And basically,
Mike Jones.
Yes, how did he become famous? He had a song called Mike Jones. It was just his name and his phone number. Like he mentioned his phone number in the song. And it's just like the most basic kind of self-promotion. I'm Mike Jones. This is my phone number. And he like blew up because of that, you know?
It was good. The first songs that I heard were good. They were catchy. And I think they had that chop screw sound that we discussed in the last episode. But let me address...
But that's like a form of tagging in the audio sphere, you know?
Sure.
And I think once
you mentioned that happens a lot in hip hop.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, that's one thing that I've always found unique and interesting about hip hop. Like every performer, whether MC, DJ, or whatever, has his or her own brand in a way, you know, all based on the name, whatever name is chosen, right?
Mm.
And so your name is your brand. And really that has an ancient origin too. Like if we go back again to Samaria, this is where we see the development of cylinder seals. You know, people started having their own logo or whatever on a cylinder seal, and they use that to identify themselves, right? It was their brand. They would use it for legal documents or whatever. Of course, they do that in China too. They have those.
Sorry, so what were these cylinder things?
Cylinder seals.
What was their purpose?
Well, it would have some kind of name or logo. I mean, we would call it a logo today, or icon. You know, that was associated with something, a particular person or family, or maybe a government institution or whatever.
But I mean, what was the cylinder seal is my point. Like what the actual object itself was.
What was it? Well,
what was its purpose?
Well, they would roll it onto maybe a clay tablet or something, and it would leave an impression.
Okay.
You know?
So it was kind of like a stamp.
Yes, I was just about to mention, like in Asian culture, the Chinese stamp, or they call it a chop here, right? Often with red ink, you stamp whatever document, and that is what makes it authentic. Like even now in Taiwan, when I sign a contract, with a Chinese speaking person, usually they have a red chop, a stamp that they dip in red ink, and that's what makes it official.
Okay.
Even more than a signature. I think they did that in Korea too, didn't they? Maybe
Possibly.
not.
So can we come back to your initial argument that you admire the tag? Can I respond to that, or am I cutting you off on some?
Well, again,
I want to address that, but I can table it if you wanted to finish the thought.
I want to say that in a way that may have been the birth of identity. Like before that, people were all just anonymous. That is, without a name, and it was only the act of declaring it. I mean, maybe they had names; they were called something, right? But there was nothing to distinguish one person from another in the mass, right? But this desire to put one's name out there.
Mass? What do you mean in the mass?
I mean, just like to distinguish yourself from everyone else by publicizing your name, branding yourself, and and this could be good and bad, right? Like maybe this is the beginning of egoism too, right? Like this obsession with an identity. I am here, I exist, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of like a decent segue into
your criticism.
My criticism.
You're not comfortable with that, and I'm not entirely comfortable with it either. So,
but I mean,
explain.
Yeah, well, I want to take one of your both end positions on this because I like what you stated in terms of the affirming need, or the role that this affirmation, the positive role that this affirmation can play in a person's life, especially if they're feeling like they're unheard. And some of the points that were made in different documentaries that I watched, some of the points that were made about graffiti, like, for example, somebody's put that billboard there, a company, we didn't necessarily all sign off on that, but they just have, that's like how power manifests. Like, so they take up our aesthetic, right? I remember learning once about a city in South America where they banned all billboards, like all kind of visual billboards, visual ads on a wall or something, as like a way to protect the eyes, like to give us freedom of vision from capitalism, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Or the aggression of marketing. So some graffiti artists were like defending their work when they painted on a billboard, for example. They're like saying, well, this is who gives them more of a right to be seen in the public square than me. So, but I'm just, if we just come down to in general, the way that a lot of graffiti artists would like articulate this kind of need to get their name everywhere, it just did seem very base and like kind of childish to me at my age or whatever, my space mentally. It's like to just go around. I mentioned this to my friend Aiden today, and it's kind of like a dog pissing, to like mark his property. It's like
territorial.
Yeah, and not really. And what is it giving, like so, and just this like arousing feeling that a person gets from seeing their name, just seeing their name scribbled somewhere, like that's really gonna like get you high. Like, I'm sorry, but that's pretty lame. And then and then me as a citizen of a city, as a pedestrian, I've been, my eyes have opened in the last 10 days to my surroundings more, which is interesting actually, because I just don't really pay much attention to graffiti usually, but I do see it quite a bit now in the last week. Like, oh wow, there's graffiti, there's graffiti, there's graffiti. And obviously I'm in St. Petersburg, Russia. But I will say, like, tagging in general, I would prefer it's not there. Like, visually, I'd prefer it just wasn't there, because I don't really, although now it's kind of cool to think about the backstory behind the tag, which I didn't usually do before. So now I'm like thinking, what time did they go out at night to do that? And who did that? So it's nice to like make it a bit more three-dimensional by just thinking about it in a deeper way than just seeing it as a scribble. But still, like, I don't think it makes the environment more beautiful. And as I said, if I was given the choice, I would say I'd rather it not be there. And it does strike me as kind of like arrogant in a way to, without wanting to go to the other extreme and sounding like one of the cops or the mayor in that documentary we watched.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to become that parody, but
right.
At the same time, like, yeah, I'm just not that into the tagging visually. So, yeah.
What was Mayor Ed Koch's statement? He said, "Make your mark in society, not on society."
Right.
And the concerns that the cops were expressing didn't really move me. It's like, this caused $10 million worth of damage, and okay. And we're supposed to get excited about that. I mean, like, that's the biggest problem in New York City or in America or in the world. I mean, let me ask you this before I forget.
Sure.
In Taipei City, there is a park, or maybe there are several parks, where entire walls are set aside for graffiti artists. It's like, okay, you can do your graffiti art here. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like, it's like condoned by the city. Now, one thing,
it's like a skate park.
Yeah. Yes.
Kind of.
Yeah. But, one other aspect of the graffiti of, the New York scene in the 80s is that it is transgressive. It is like,
absolutely,
it's criminal, actually, not like murder or rape or something, but it is a violation.
You can get locked away. You can absolutely go to prison for a long time.
It's a violation of societal norms. And so there's a musician, the founder of the Brian Jonestown Massacre, Anton something, I can't remember his name, but his Twitter profile reads art/crime. I mean, he's a musician, and I think he does some visual art too, but it's like art/crime. And it reminds me of the French painter Delacroix, who allegedly said that, a painter or any artist should approach each new work as if he or she were committing a crime. You want to do something that violates the norms of your society. That's what art does. It pushes boundaries. It's transgressive. Maybe some people think it crosses over into crime, and that's okay. So that, there is a transgressive aspect to this that we have to consider. But then you see, you've got these.
And let me just add on to that really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned the public space, and I watched another documentary, a Vice documentary about like the Miami scene. And yeah, it seems like a certain district in Miami, authorities just kind of gave up on it. And like now it is a free for all with graffiti. Like it's allowed, but it's mainly looks good now because it's mainly like beautiful murals and stuff. But it's an area where a cop just will let you work. Like they just won't bother with it. It's just kind of like been accepted.
Yeah.
But the last thing I want to add is just most of the graffiti artists who I saw interviewed, they were absolutely committed to that transgressive aspect. Like that is part and parcel. You know, it's crucial. It's not. They even like they were almost dismissive of it. If it doesn't have that buzz, if it doesn't have that element of danger, of sneaking out, of jeopardy, personal jeopardy, then it's like you can't distinguish graffiti, the work that they do, from that.
Yeah, and so to them, probably this graffiti art created in a safe space that's like approved by the city and the society and the government and everything, that's not authentic. That's not legit. That's some bullshit. It's like,
right.
Really? That's what you're talking about, you know? And on the topic of danger, we're not just talking legal danger. There's like physical danger. Remember the one-armed artist in Style Wars?
Yeah.
Didn't he have some accident?
No. He was like 2 years old when that happened. It wasn't related to graffiti.
Okay, well, maybe not that guy, but other people have been injured,
for
right?
Sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
Some people have died, you know, like trying to bomb or tag something.
Right. To go all city, which is another term I learned.
What's
to go
that?
All city means that you're everywhere in the city, or sometimes it can mean that you're on like every train line, I guess. So that was like often a goal for these writers in New York, to have their stuff on every one of the lines.
Okay.
Which is interesting. Yeah.
Well, what happens when one of these transgressive artists, and we could ask this about any transgressive artist, whether in music or, you know, literature or the visual arts, film. What happens when a transgressive artist goes mainstream? Because I'm thinking about, we could talk about hip hop artists, but I'm thinking about like
Banksy.
Yes, of course, Banksy is the most obvious current example, but take it back to the 80s, emerging out of this New York graffiti
I know
culture.
You're going to say.
Say it.
Go on. Sorry, no, I should just become
No,
Basquiat.
say it.
You're going to talk about Basquiat?
Of course, and also Keith Haring, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And they started doing that. I mean, Basquiat is interesting because he originally was using the tag SAMO, SAMO.
Okay.
Did you hear that? It's like same old, but he used SAMO, SAMO, and a friend of his was also using it. It's kind of, they had like a crew, you know, and they were all using the tag SAMO, I think, or maybe it was only two of them. But then like Basquiat started using that exclusively, and the other guy or other guys in the crew were like, "What the fuck, man? Now you're SAMO, and what about the rest of us? That was supposed to be a collective thing." You know,
what do you mean he used it exclusively? Like he didn't allow them to use it?
Well, I mean, he started using it in his paintings too. It wasn't just like in graffiti art. And then he started being recognized as SAMO, and he went along with it. Like he was doing interviews. He's like, "Yeah, I'm SAMO." And the other guy or guys were like, "What? No, you're not. You're just one of us." And he's like, No, I'm SAMO." So he kind of like appropriated that identity. And then Keith Haring or Haring, I remember he was like arrested for doing graffiti art, but then he became one of the big names of that whole scene. It was basically Keith Haring and Basquiat and maybe a couple of others. So it reminds me of the Brian Eno term scenius, not genius, right? Scenius. And so what does this mean? Eno's argument is that we need to focus more on scene, right? Not individuals.
Right.
You know, it's not
We've had
like
this conversation.
Yeah.
I can't remember what context.
Okay. Well,
do you remember?
I don't. Maybe it was when we were talking about the Bowie album, but I don't think I introduced this term scenius.
You didn't. But we talked about the collective versus the individual.
Well, but
I
what
don't
do you
remember
think?
when,
What
but
do you think about that? Because this is a whole culture. It's a scene, right? But then only certain individuals are elevated and considered important in quotation marks. It's like, okay, there's Basquiat, Keith Haring, and a couple of others. Nobody else matters. They're not important. Uh, and same thing happens with music or anything else. Like certain individuals are accepted into the mainstream and they kind of like blow up and their careers take off or whatever, and everyone else can eat shit and die, even though they're all coming out of the same scene.
yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on whose respect you're after. Because within the graffiti world, it seems like, people are respecting the right people. And,
The right people.
well, what I mean by that is like the ones who, from our perspective, probably would deserve merit. Like, I'm saying the graffiti artists themselves, they're not like, probably like dick riding Banksy, like they're giving props just like a hip hop purist would be giving props to like KRS-One or, whoever is considered like an actual true rapper who kept it real. So the graffiti community, they're going to also be championing the people that they think are doing the good stuff. Like,
Well,
that they
sure.
admire.
I mean, yeah, that's always going to be the case, But like, I think what I'm getting at is more the mainstream acceptance of certain people. I mean, there are always going to be people like Jay Dilla, for example, who are trying to elevate the more obscure, right? The
Right.
less popular, so that they not be forgotten, their work
Right.
live on, right? But I mean, is it inevitable? Is it just because the mainstream, for example, only has a certain amount of bandwidth? Like the mainstream.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, even, but it's like my job as an educator would be to get someone to know who Basquiat is, like, so that's underground to a certain extent, right? It's like it's a mainstream artist for somebody who likes art, but even Basquiat is like obscure for some people, right? Is like that's like like getting a knowledge of Basquiat like shows some literacy. So it's just it's all relative and it's all levels. And sometimes somebody like Basquiat can be a primer, I guess, right? Or like a gateway to something else. You need some kind of thing to get you into the scene.
But it's interesting how that transgressive art, and not just in the visual arts, but everything, rock and roll, hip hop, it all began as something on the fringes. It was like transgressive. It was like, don't listen to this. It's satanic. Don't read this. It'll corrupt your soul. You'll burn in hell. And then eventually it becomes accepted by the mainstream and diluted and watered down and less interesting, right?
Sure.
So it's all this process is ongoing.
Yeah.
Like what today is considered mainstream was, originally thought to be disgusting or repulsive or criminal even.
Sure.
So what does that tell us? Like when we're confronted with something new now and we think, oh, that doesn't agree with my standards. That's garbage. I mean, we may be missing something, right? Like, yeah, in 10 years, you're going to say that's a masterpiece. Or maybe in 5 years or in 20 years.
Yeah, agreed. Do you think that applies to my criticism of tagging? I'm willing to take that accusation if you think so, but I just wonder about, how do you feel about, so you said you like tagging.
Well, it is both and. I certainly can understand your, hesitancy to like fully embrace it. I mean, there is something pathetic about it and kind of like, not that admirable.
Is there any
if it's
graffiti
just
in Taipei?
if it's just the kick of seeing your name,
Right,
getting your name out there, that is kind of lame.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I told you there's like the
you mentioned the public space, but is there like an actual scene
well,
that's
I mean,
not
there
in public spaces?
Yeah, yes. Actually, I know a young man that is like part of that scene. I've not talked to him about like the legal versus the more transgressive aspects of the culture, but I mean, I think this guy that I'm talking about is serious about being a full-time artist. Like he wants to make it his career, but he like that's where he got his start. That sparked his interest.
But I mean, is there the criminal side of it going on in Taipei? Like, do you see it on storefronts?
I mean, it's more yes. The answer is yes. Yes, you
okay.
do. But it's more, it's less threatening, I guess you could say, than
because we have some stereotypes about Asian cultures, maybe, or certain Asian cultures being very law-abiding, and like you wouldn't. I don't have no idea, but do you think Japan has a graffiti scene that's illegal?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it's less prominent. Maybe they clean it up more quickly. I don't know. Korea did,
because that's the
right?
culture that I think is like the most extreme with both liking cleanliness and also kind of, I don't know, are they rule followers? Am I wrong in that stereotype of Japan?
Well, I don't know. We'd have to take Mishima into consideration if we're talking about that, but
this is a side note, but I just read an article today that there's a scandal right now in Japan because there are these rotating sushi restaurants,
Mm.
And with Japanese people
with the conveyor belt?
Yeah, with the conveyor belt. And
right.
Japanese people take hygiene really seriously,
Yeah.
And there are viral videos going on now where like somebody will fuck with some of the sushi that's going around. Like some 14-year-old kid was like taking the sushi and like licking it and then putting it back on.
Nasty.
And other people putting extra wasabi into like a spot, into like one of the rolls. Yeah. So now they've changed the way that it's run. So now, for example, the soy sauce and stuff like that, you have to go and pick it up yourself. Like it's in a one certain area. I don't know. And it's causing like a national hysteria. And it's,
well, so there's your answer.
Interesting.
There's your answer. It exists,
Right.
But remember, there was graffiti in Korea. I remember around like Hongdae.
Yeah.
And of course, Itaewon, you could always find some. And mentioning Japan, I remember someone had like the phrase "fuck Japs," and then someone else would write underneath it "stop hate."
Right.
That there's like a dialogue going on.
Right. Right.
I think a picture of that appeared in an issue of Co-Reality, if I remember correctly.
It's true. Okay, I want to shout out a couple things. Can I? All right. Yeah. So, when Maria suggested this topic, and then you and I end up watching Style Wars, I almost feel like, so we've got graffiti, and for me, graffiti is very linked. Modern graffiti is very linked, well, with hip hop in some way, right? Like it's this like urban youth thing that is a subculture. I guess I'm just wondering if the graffiti that is portrayed in something like Style Wars or just the urban America, but not only, obviously it's everywhere, but is that what she wanted us to discuss? I mean, is that what she had in mind when she thought about graffiti? Because that's almost like a style, but graffiti, just the act of writing something in a public space, right? It's almost like we shouldn't let that pure thing be co-opted by this kind of like more like a subculture with a certain specific aesthetic and certain language. That, I don't know. I just think in a way they're two different things. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about style wars, not Star Wars, that's obviously rooted in a particular time and place. New York City, early '80s, right? But let's consider other examples of graffiti. I mean, you said you wanted to talk about like Pompeii, so tell us what you.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's go there for sure. But also, even in modern day, like, surely there's more to graffiti than like the subculture that we know, which is like spraying trains, tagging your name, like this whole kind of like, I don't want to say machismo because obviously there's women involved too, but this kind of like underground subculture that has a certain agreement, right, within it, and it has its stars and it has its crews. But graffiti, you know, like Maria said, oh, St. Petersburg must be like an interesting place right now with the political situation. And I think she was hoping that maybe I would be able to share some examples of, you know, some anti-government stuff or anti-war stuff, which I don't really see, if I'm honest. I think I did see it a little bit, and I paid attention to it at the beginning. I saw people writing like "Niet Vojna," like "No War."
Yeah.
But in general, like I don't see much of that, and it's not like this like really exciting way of activism in St. Petersburg, as far as I see. Like I don't really see that as a major response. But I just wonder what other types of graffiti we could consider besides like the culture of graffiti. Like maybe
what about
talk about toilets?
Yeah, exactly. What about writing on the toilet wall? You know, like just imagine the iconic cover of the Stones album, right? Beggar's Banquet.
Yeah,
It's just
I'm kind of familiar with it.
It's just a toilet with graffiti, and I think there's like a half-used roll of toilet paper.
Right.
Yeah. What about that? I mean, that is scratching on a public surface, right? And often, you know, speaking of the transgressive aspect, often these messages are obscene, right? Like there's an obscene sexual picture and often a sexual message. You know, the most stereotypical such message would be for a good time call, you know, whatever number, and then ask for this girl that you are trying to publicly shame, you know, or guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I used to see the most of that on like road trips, right? Either at like
rest stops,
some kind of rest stops, exactly. And I loved it, you know, as someone who was, as long as the toilet itself wasn't too nasty, you know. But like, if the toilet itself, the toilet seat was okay, you know, I was delighted to be able to spend a couple minutes reading all that stuff, you know, and hoping that I'd find some good entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
What about you? Did you have similar
as you're
enjoyment?
saying that? I mean, I don't recall being particularly impressed by the artwork or the text messages on toilet walls, but you know, if you're
amused.
amused. If you're sitting there or standing there, you know, it passes the time, I suppose. But as you're saying this, I'm reminded of a comment that Thoreau makes in, I guess it must be Walden, or maybe it's on civil disobedience or one of his other essays. But he's talking about when he was in prison for, and this is another place, right? Not only toilet walls, but prison walls. But when he was in prison for tax evasion, you know, he refused to support the Spanish-American War. he got locked up, and he talks about reading some of the messages. He's being facetious, I think, but he says, I enjoyed perusing the messages inscribed on the wall of my cell by previous occupants, or something like that.
Right.
So this is a very long-standing tradition, and I want you to take it back to Pompeii, because you had mentioned that before. Like, what do you want to say about that in particular?
Well, and you probably have more experience than me thinking about those ancient inscriptions. I just know that a lot of it was also highly sexual, boasts of prowess, sexual prowess. I don't know if you would call this graffiti, but in one of the rooms or areas in Pompeii, it was like a brothel, and they had inscriptions on the walls of all the different positions, and you could order one of the positions, basically. Oh, wow. So you'd point to that position and say,
it's like a menu.
Yeah, exactly.
A sexual menu. And it was just inscribed on the wall?
No, there were pictures.
Oh, I see.
Pictures of the different positions. But it seems like one of the documentaries about ancient graffiti that I watched, it kind of went into the different basic purposes that graffiti served. So we've already talked about tagging. That would be like existence, right? So affirming your existence. Then there's the graffiti that declares love, right? Which is like another common trope.
What about like carving initials into a tree? That's not a public space, but it's part of the commons, or it could be if it's like in a park.
Why is it not a public space?
Well, I mean, a tree is not like a publicly owned building, or a privately owned building, but it's in the commons, So yeah, it could be a public space, but what if you did it like out in the woods somewhere, or that's
different, yeah, but
in a forest, like if initials are carved into a tree in the forest and no one's there, is it ever seen? You know what I'm talking about. If a tree falls.
Yeah, I get it.
But that's carving, that's scratching,
Right. And I've written some stuff like that about like girls, but I've done it in places that a lot of people are doing it, So it's almost like it's a work of art. The fact that all these lovers are declaring. But
what about when you see that at like restaurants? Restaurants have a place where you can.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I've done stuff like that. I like at a Korean restaurant here in St. Petersburg. Like I wrote something for Liliana, and I took a picture of it. A few years ago, actually. So yeah, I think that can be interesting. But yeah, I'm just not really into being the first to like deface a tree, for example, like a virginal tree,
Oh yeah.
It's like
well, one thing I wanted to do as a teenager was scratch my initials in wet concrete,
Yeah.
like my dad was repaving the driveway or something like that. Right. Or I think he added on to the driveway because we had like a basketball goal and he wanted to have like a 3-point arc, and I remember he poured the concrete and I went over there with a stick and I was going to write Mark and Tiff because I had a girlfriend named Tiffany, and he was furious. He's like, "What? No, that was not allowed." It's like, that'll be here forever. And of course he's not the kind of person that would be amused by something like that. So it didn't happen.
He just reminded me too of like plaques, right? Whenever there's like a new museum and you're one of the funders, you get your name for a certain amount of money. Or even when they build like a stadium now, if you donate a certain thing, you'll get your name, immortalized.
So see,
but it always seems
that's like the rich folks version of
exactly
tagging,
exactly
So
exactly
so in that sense, it's like these inner city youth or underprivileged young people, whether black or white or Latino or whatever, if we're talking about the New York City scene,
right.
That's their way of saying, I am here, I exist. Just like the
Right.
rich people have a more respectable way. They put their name on a fucking stadium or they donate a music hall to a university, or
Right.
they have a research grant named after them. What is
Right.
that if not
But-
tagging,
But I am here, I exist is different than like boasting about your money, basically, right?
So
or
it's
your
even
philanthropy.
more obscene, right? Like it's more.
I agree with you.
Yeah, it's more
Exactly.
disgusting to be the kind of person that wants to have a building named after you than to be just inscribing or spray painting your name on
Right.
on a wall.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Um,
I can
Yeah.
go into a couple. So another purpose is imparting wisdom, and that could be, that could be given in a very crude way, like "Don't worry, be happy." I mean, maybe or that's not even that crude, but I'm trying to come back to the toilet,
like
But I think
sloganeering, like just some kind of epigrammatic.
yeah, like even somebody wrote like "It's not worth it" or something, or like "Fuck them," whatever. That would be like a version of imparting wisdom, and I guess they were doing that in Pompeii or in those kind of times, like.
Well, yeah, and the Roman epigram probably has its origin in that kind of thing. An epigram is just a very short, often it's 2 lines of verse, I'm thinking of like Catullus. A lot of the, well, I won't say a lot, but there are a few very short pieces in his collection that are epigrams, and often they're insults.
Right.
They're like.
Well, that was going to be the next category: insults
Okay.
and curses. That was the final category I had.
Oh, there you go.
That's it.
Yeah, but it became like, just as with Basquiat, graffiti art found its way into, let's say, respectable art or high art. The primitive insult became like a valid poetic form with Catullus and Martial and some of these other Roman poets. And I think, certainly they would have been exposed to like graffiti. So they kind of like elevated the art of graffiti to poet. Well, we call it respectable now. We consider it a classic, but in the day, was that the case? Like, it's not like everybody celebrated Catullus or Martial or any of them,
Right.
because they were social critics too, right? They were like, Catullus says, he has like a fairly derogative epigram about Caesar, for example. So yeah, we're up on 55 minutes, so we're going to have to wrap this up soon. But I wanted to talk about like, if we're still considering that New York scene, we talked about graffiti being the written word, right? And rap is the spoken word, and breaking or break dancing is like body language. So what other senses are involved? We've got
what's
eye
scratching?
and ear. Scratching, yeah, that's like, I don't know, kinesthetic, right? It involves the body, maybe. You got eye and
But I
ear,
thought,
visual versus
yeah,
auditory. Well, yeah, breaking is also kinesthetic, right? It involves the body and
right,
movement of the body. So I don't know, scratching, that's also auditory. That's also the ear.
right.
Are we missing something? What kind of transgressive art would focus on smell? Like you have some kind of transgressive
Farting in
perfume,
public.
farting in public. There you go. Or like you know, do you know the Patrick Susskind novel Perfume?
Hmm.
Yeah, the guy that creates these amazing perfumes that cause people to enter states of ecstasy.
Just
You
take it
know,
all off. Yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
he's kind of like he's a criminal himself. I think I don't know what that has to
Mm.
do with graffiti, but it popped into my mind, so of course I'm going to mention it. All right, maybe we should. If
I
you
mean,
don't have anything else, we should probably
no, I mean, I
wrap it up
do.
here.
I think I could go a little bit longer, just talking about the physical environments that we're living in, and the fact that they have these layers. I mean, I just think it's been interesting for me now just to imagine again who did this tag that I see, and what time of night was it when they came out, and what proportion of my environment is covered by graffiti, and like, I don't know, yeah, just its role in like our aesthetic landscape, how we kind of become unconscious to it, right? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
do. And then suddenly, oh, I have a podcast on graffiti this week. Oh shit, look, there. It's everywhere, It's
Yeah, yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
That's kind of interesting how it's like this part of our daily existence that we kind of maybe push to the side, just dismiss as, oh, that's graffiti,
Mm-hmm.
right? Oh, that without, and that's been interesting just to think about how there's a whole language, yeah, like, or there's something called wild style. Like, wild style is when you write your name, but in a way that's so kind of like convoluted that it's hard to read,
Yeah.
right? Versus like a straight style. I don't know. It's just, it's interesting that it's existing around us all the time. I guess that's all. I don't really know what else to say about that, but that there's these layers to our existence that we're just
Well, and
like,
that
we're not.
and there are many other things like that, right? That are part of the environment, but if we don't give them our attention and we
Right.
don't think about them, we don't notice them, they don't have much conscious influence on us, right? So like anything
Yeah.
else, when you are attentive, when you focus on it, new things are revealed to you, and
Right.
you see all those depths and levels and layers.
What about graffiti's role in terms of activism? Because again, if I come back to what Maria was maybe looking for us to probe, it would be like graffiti's ability to have a social impact. So do you think that it can be like a really strong tool for shaping public consciousness and rallying people?
Well, as you're asking this, I'm thinking of that stupid '80s movie Turk 182 that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
That was the whole point. Like this guy's brother was a fireman, and they were not giving him his pension because they said he got injured when he went into a burning building, and they tried to, like, the higher ups tried to say that he was drunk because he had like a beer in a bar, and then he got the call and he ran in and saved someone, and he fell and broke his back, right? And they're like, oh, we're not going to cover his medical bills because he was drunk. And then his brother started of course, his brother was upset about that. So to call attention to it, he started spray painting the name Turk 182 everywhere. I think it started with graffiti. And then eventually, like he somehow got into like a football stadium or something and rewired the lights so it said Turk 182 on the big screen, And then people eventually realized, oh, it's the name and number of this firefighter. And then, like, eventually he was able to get some kind of compensation for his brother. We're just now over an hour. So, yeah, I guess that can happen, but I don't know. I think when I think of, like, protest messages, it's usually signage of some sort, right? Like people carrying signs when they're marching, not spray painting messages on buildings. But
it is exciting and empowering when some, I don't want to talk too heavily about Russia here because I don't know, I have my own paranoia about that. But, it does feel good when a government claims to have full support of its citizenry and, and it's that what to then go see somebody saying F the leader or, or just making statements that are really outspoken. I think there is something like comforting and empowering about that when you know that there is an opposition, right? Or it's almost like 1984, the kind of the vibes that you'd get just by, maybe exchanging a glance with someone and knowing that they're also like on your side. So yeah, I think it can be quite courageous and positive at times like that, perhaps, and useful.
Well, everybody at one time or another has enjoyed anti-authoritarianism, right?
Right.
Some of us enjoy it more than others. But any kind of like, even the most mainstream movie will often have some kind of anti-authoritarian figure as the hero or heroine or whatever. Are we allowed to say heroine now?
I wanted to share my anecdote really quickly because you just reminded me of one of the happiest memories I have in a way in my life, which was this night where me, my sister, and Christy, maybe I've told you this story, but because I wrote about it actually in Co-Reality. Yeah, but we snuck out and we switched the letters on one of these school signs.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how the schools will have dates?
Yes.
What is that thing called? Do you know what the name of that thing is called?
Marquee?
The marquee, the marquee. And we switched it to Stop War instead of Parent-Teacher Conference.
Right.
And we switched another one to USA 1, Iraq 0. Obviously not happy about that, but just taking a piss out of that. And then I tried calling a news station that morning to say, hey, we saw this. Maybe you guys should report on it. But that was such a rush, seeing how long that would last and imagining cars driving by. So if I think about that and I think about some of these graffiti artists who are just getting a rush out of having their shit seen, maybe I shouldn't see myself as above it, right? Just because my message happens to be what I consider valorous and noble and righteous, but that shouldn't give me some kind of superiority. So yeah, I've got off. My point is, I've got off and felt the excitement of that transgression.
Yeah,
and also of having made a statement in the public sphere, of having myself seen and heard. I don't know what we would call that. I mean, it is a kind of graffiti in that you are writing by rearranging someone else's letters, right? Right.
But I don't know, is there a technical term for that? I mean, it's a form of what they call culture jamming, and maybe graffiti itself is a kind of culture jamming. It's like you take the mainstream message and you flip it or parody it or distort it or, otherwise deconstruct it.
I mean, we definitely had a message as well. I wanted to, you just made me think about social media too, and like how I'm not a really prolific tweeter, or poster, but some people that are just constantly tweeting, it's like they're also, right, getting that constant need to be seen, to be recognized. I mean, that could just, I don't know, that could go into a lot of topics, so maybe that's too much to cover, but
Yeah.
I have thought about that impulse people have to just, right, constantly be recognized.
Well, and it's often, I mean, that's a toxic waste dump. There's a lot of invective there too, insults, right? People calling each other out, talking shit.
Right.
So that's certainly,
yeah, exactly. So it's the new wall.
Yeah,
where people just write shit.
Well, isn't that what Facebook called people's profiles like wall, right? In the beginning? Hey, you want to write on my wall or write on your friend's wall?
Right.
So that's like online graffiti, but again, that's in a very highly regulated, safe space controlled by big tech. It's not not so transgressive, of course.
Right.
In fact, it's the opposite. You're just like providing data to fucking Zuckerberg and his ilk. All right, tell us what's next. Next episode.
Yeah, so next we are going to take another request. This is from Steve Wasserman, who has a podcast of his own called Cannabis Cone. And he's requested that we talk about the film Synecdoche, which neither of us have seen.
Synecdoche, New York.
Yeah, it's meant to be good and very interesting. I think it's going to be quite a headfuck, to be honest, because I've heard it's very easy to get lost in it. It's by director Caden Cotard and stars Philip Seymour Hoffman.
Okay.
Director Charlie Kaufman. The character in the film is Caden Cotard. So it's Charlie Kaufman, directed and written by.
I think this is the director that did Being John Malkovich, right?
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Which I liked.
Yeah, I've seen that, but not Synecdoche, New York. And Synecdoche is a callback to our episode on fascism. Remember that?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the episode. The word Synecdoche I still feel insecure about.
Right. You wanted to say Synecdoche.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
Appropriate it for yourself,
Thank you.
Be transgressive.
So,
all right. Let's end it there.
Reminder to everyone that you can now see our podcasts as well as hear them. So if you're listening to this on one of our Substacks, do know that we are also distributing our content on YouTube, and there'll be links to that in our Substacks.
That's right.
Okay. Peace out, everybody.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.